In this video, we're going to talk about exceptions in Java. For this purpose, do import this project exception into your workspace and open up these files. We talked about compile time errors. For example, if I type in some random text, it's going to show us a compile time error. Similarly, if you're trying to assign a float value to an integer, it's going to throw us a compile time error. Compiler will not compile the program unless we fix all these errors. That being said, the ultimate job of compiler is to translate your code into a language that a JVM can understand. That means the bytecode. Compiler does not take full responsibility on fixing your errors. It will only try its best. What I mean by that is that there could be a scenario where an error could come when you run the program. That means compiler compiles the program successfully, but an error could come when we run the program. These kind of errors that come during the runtime are called exceptions. Well, the actual definition of an exception is not an error that comes in during the runtime. In fact, we're going to form our own definition of an exception after we take a look at this example. In here, I have just created an object of this class, exceptionTemp, in which I have a method that will just simply return this string. We have few instructions in here and we know what those are. I'm calling this method and passing this object as an argument. Inside this method, I'm calling another method, method2, and I'm passing in the same object. And we're using that object to call this example method. Pretty well and good. Let's see the output first. Pretty well and good. Now, let's say I'm passing in here null. Maybe accidentally. Now let's run the program and see what's going to happen. It has executed these 2 lines of code and something went wrong in here, due to which these instructions didn't get executed. So what has actually happened? Let's take a look. We're passing null here. Eventually it will end up in here. So it's going to be like this, null.example, which doesn't make sense. It has to be an object. The reason why this is called a null pointer exception is called the reference type is actually pointing to null. What do I mean by that? For example, we have a reference type object obj, and this reference type is pointing to null, and that's why this is called a null pointer exception. And this exception will only come in when we run the program. It's okay to have exceptions here and there, but it shouldn't cause the entire program to crash. In this example, these 2 instructions are innocent. Still, they didn't get executed. This is a big concern, especially for bigger applications. We can't expect the entire software to crash just because of one single exception behind the scenes. And there is a good reason why JVM don't execute all the subsequent instructions. That's because JVM thinks that if it executes all the subsequent instructions, there could be side effects due to the failure in this line. It makes sense from JVM perspective, but from programmer perspective, he wants all the rest of the instructions to be executed regardless of there is an exception somewhere in the middle of the code. How do we handle this? Is by using exception handling. Before we take a look at the exception handling, let us talk about something called a call stack. Whenever JVM comes across with an exception, the JVM is going to create an object of that particular exception. In this case, it's null pointer exception. And the JVM is going to throw that exception. When JVM throws that exception, there has to be something that will catch it. In this program, we don't have anything to catch it. So JVM tries to find some block of code that will catch that exception. If it doesn't find, JVM will throw that exception to the calling method, which in this case this method. And even in here, we don't have any block that will catch that exception. The JVM keeps throwing that exception and it will eventually end up in the main method. And even in here, we don't have a catch block or a handler code, and hence JVM will just stop executing rest of the instructions and it will just abruptly stop the program. So somehow as a programmer, we need to convey the JVM that it's okay if you find exception, I still want to continue with the rest of my instructions. So how do we convey the same? By just looking at this program, you could make a guess that there is a possibility of getting a null pointer exception in this line. So what you're going to do is you're going to wrap this code. You could have more than one line, so obviously. You can wrap this code into a block called try block. As simple as that. By doing this, you're telling the JVM that try this block of code, and within this block, if you come across with any kind of exceptions, throw that exception and I'll catch it. And the way you catch it is by using the keyword catch. And what is that exception that you're trying to catch? Is null pointer exception. And you have the handler code in here. By doing so, you're letting the JVM know that you're aware of the potential exception that's going to come in here. Now from JVM perspective, since it's sure that you're aware of what you're doing, it won't mind executing the rest of the instructions. Now if you run the program, everything runs smoothly despite having an exception in here. Alternatively, you can just use the IDE's facility to wrap this code inside try and catch is by going to source, surround with try catch block. Let's run the program. Pretty well and good. And you see the call stack in here. Well, that's what is an exception in general and how we basically handle it. Let's continue in our next video.